the culprit themselves. Their associates are pretty good actually with describing the materials.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they could definitely answer all your questions, but and if you haven't opened, if you've bought oil pastels and you haven't opened them, you can certainly exchange them, take them back. So with my, let's see, I'm gonna orient my paper here. With my drawing, I don't know if you guys can see both the photograph as well as my drawing pad. Move this over just a little bit. What I want to think about is, first of all, filling up the space of my drawing paper with the subject matter. So if I've got an apple about the size of my fist, I want that to be about that size in the composition, okay? So if I make things too small, especially when I'm using something that's like these big sticks, it's going to be tricky for me to kind of get in there with any amount of control. So make those fill up the space of your paper as much as possible. So I've done the still life here with just fruits and vegetables. You don't have to have like anything super fancy, but if you've got, a couple of apples and a couple of bananas laying around your house, you'll be fine. Because one additional bit of complexity you can add to it is you can slice one open, you can peel the banana, you can peel a lime, whatever you have sitting around the house in your refrigerator or in your pantry, you can use that as long as it's got some color to it. And you want to have at least some things kind of overlapping, other things, right? So that they're not all kind of isolated on the space. So I put some in a bowl, I put some on the table, but I also, underneath that, I have those bits of kind of blue pillowcases, right? Just to add something different other than the white table, okay? So another bit of element of color there. But what I've done here is drawn very lightly with my pencil the basic composition, right? Don't need to get the details in there. And in fact, none of my lines here are really super exact, right? If I get too exact and too hard with my pencil lines, one thing that's really hard to do with pastels is covering up pencil. If you use a lot of pressure with your pencil to start with, oftentimes it can incise the paper, and it's hard to kind of get rid of that effect as you use soft pastels. So keep it nice and light with your pencil at the beginning. But the next thing I want to do before I get too involved in terms of the pencil lines is I want to look at my subject matter to figure out, okay, what are the light colored objects, to start with those, and then to work my way towards the deeper ones and the darker ones. Places that are going to be light that I know of, like the banana, the lemon, those might be good things to start with, okay? So for the purpose of the demo, move this over just a little bit. I think I'll do maybe part of the banana, I'll do part of the apple, and maybe one other object. But what I want to do is start with my light colored object, which is my banana, and I'm gonna obviously use my yellow, but one thing you might break your heart to do this, but what I do is break my pastels at least in half. What that does, it gives me a little more flexibility to use the side of the pastel, and I can maneuver it a little better than a big stick, right? So that's something that I like to do right off the bat. What I'm going to do is to put a layer of that yellow throughout the shape, knowing that it's not going to be the same yellow everywhere in the end. I'm going to definitely make some changes to it. But let's go ahead and start with a basic, the closest color that I have in my set to the object that I'm looking at, right? So I'm going to go ahead and start with a really heavy layer of that. And pastels, you want to keep in mind that you are really kind of like painting in layers with pastels, right? You don't have to get the color right off the bat, but you're gonna add layers to it to get closer and closer to the color that you need.
So you say the colors do not mix then, right?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying they do mix, and that's why you want to use layers.
Oh, okay.
So I'll show you what I mean here. So I've got a layer of yellow. Obviously that doesn't look much like the banana I'm looking at. So what I'm going to do right off the bat is look at the colors of that object. And one thing I notice is that the yellow starts to get slightly more, I'm going to break my orange here, starts to get slightly more kind of warm and orangey towards the edges. And something I mentioned in our assignment description is that I encourage you to draw these objects from life rather than a photo, because you do notice subtle shifts of color in real life that you might not notice if you're drawing it from a photograph. And so you notice what I did here is just put a little bit of orange along the edge. And now what I'm going to do is to go back with my original yellow and I'm blending that orange almost like a paintbrush and pushing that orange into the color, making it slightly more of a golden yellow. And something else I notice that happens is right here in the center of this part of the banana is that it starts to get a little bit lighter. And one thing I also like to do with my white is I will keep sometimes a little square of sandpaper next to my pastel drawing so that I can swipe the pastel on that piece of sandpaper to create a clean side. So oftentimes when I'm making something light and I notice there's like black or brown or something that's already on the white pastel, if I put that on my drawing, all I'm doing is adding that color into something that I meant to be light, okay? So I want to swipe it on that, either a rag, I can use a paper towel, obviously, or a little piece of sandpaper. So what I noticed about this banana is that I've got a kind of a bright highlight, maybe the lightest part of that yellow that happens right here along the center. And it's pretty light down here as well. And I think partially the colors that I'm using here get a little bit washed out in the spotlight that I'm kind of showing. But maybe you start to see a little bit of that difference. And then you can also use your finger to kind of blend those colors together. And the trick is not to overdo the finger blending, right? Because that is definitely a possibility, right? That you overdo it. So if I looked at the banana, one thing I noticed is that the orange starts to show up along the left side here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and add some of that orange here. But then something else that I notice is the red of that apple that it's sitting next to starts to reflect a little bit on the banana. So I'm going to take some of the red, and I think it feels like it's kind of bouncing on the banana right about here. So none of this is stuff that I'm going to leave as it is, right? I've built up from the yellow to the orange. I've got some red in here and I've got some white, right? I've got several colors kind of working at once. But I think I'm also ready now to start to look at places in the banana that starts to get really dark. What I'm going to do for the darker places, what I notice is that where the red reflects from the apple right here, it also starts to get just a little bit deeper in value. So what I'm doing is adding kind of a layer of this brown. And maybe the brown continues along that shadowed side of the banana in kind of most of that section.
What color is that?
This is just a deep brown, right? It's actually the only brown I have in the set, right? So it's this kind of dark brown color. You know, this is not the end result here, and I'm not going to use my finger because a lot of times what what my finger will do is take most of that off. So instead, I'm going to go back with my yellow. I'm going to kind of push that brown into that section. I'm not going to cover it up, but I'm using just enough pressure to kind of mix the brown with the yellow. And I think there are going to be places in my drawing, and I think it's probably an edge here right along this section where it starts to get really bright again. It's dark along that shadowed side, but then it starts to brighten up right here, which is a weird thing where I think the light is bouncing back off of the apple. And then maybe at this point I'm gonna start to think about, okay, because I've got maybe 3 or 4 layers of pastel on there, now is when I'll go in with my finger. You can do this with a blending stick if you have one. You can do this with a rag. But the good thing about your finger sometimes is that you've already got some of the pastel on there. And if you put a clean finger on this section, you're probably gonna, it'll erase, right? Instead of blending. So little bit of pastel on your finger is not a bad thing in this instance.
Would a Q-tip work, or would that absorb the pastel?
Yeah, Q-tip work. Q-tip works because anything that you have found successfully that you've used with charcoal will likely work well with pastel, right? Because it's the same kind of chalky kind of medium.
I'm sorry, I got questions. But the Q-tip, if you load it up with color off the pastel before you use it to blend, is that another technique you could use?
Yes, you could. You could certainly kind of work off some color on a scratch piece of paper and kind of load up the Q-tip with it. But I wouldn't recommend as using that method for originally putting the pastel on your paper, because the pastel really requires a good amount on your paper to work with, right? If there's not enough to work with, the pastel effect starts to look too thin, right? So you want to have enough on there that you've got some substantial color to manipulate. And one last thing I'm going to do here, I've added some brown, I've added some red. There are some kind of brown spots at the bottom of the banana. Those would be kind of details that I would add at the last, right? But one last thing I'm going to do here before I move on to the apple is maybe 1 or 2 more objects. Is I'm going to think about, okay, what are the places in my banana that are the very darkest sections? One thing I notice is that towards the bottom, and then maybe also up here towards the top, it might be good to use more of this brown. But I'm also going to add just a little bit of a cool temperature to this brown to make it even darker, right? Because those values get to be pretty close, almost close to a black, right? So I've got my brown in there, but I'm going to use the kind of cool temperature of my blue. Break off a little piece of this dark blue. I'm not going to use this blue, right? Because there's so much white in this blue that it's not going to do me much good to add something like that to this if I want it to be darker, right? So I'm going to use this one. And if I take some of this blue up here at the top, put a little bit down at this bottom section where it starts to kind of, the temperature cools off.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Could you have used green?
I could have used green, however, I don't want it to turn to, well, yes, there is some green.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking, because I think I'm thinking of if I was drawing this, I think I would have added green. So I'm trying to figure out why.
Yeah, there
You
is
chose
green
to-
here at the top, so I'm glad you brought that up. So let's put some green here in this top section where the banana obviously does have a little bit of green to it. I think what I was concentrating on is like the lights and the darks, but you're absolutely right. We should have some of that green up here. And so I put the green in, but I'm going to go back with my yellow.
This is kind of what I was asking about the mixing of the colors with the layers, because doesn't blue and yellow make green, but it doesn't necessarily seem like it translates with the pastels.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there are two different ways to get to the same destination. I think that is one example. I could have mixed up this light green by using my yellow with a little bit of that same blue, right? So not necessarily a bad thing, but it might take me slightly longer, for example.
But it seems like the pastels resist each other just a little bit, not like a watercolor which mixed readily, right?
Yeah, I mean, you will have a little bit of the medium kind of holding on to what to what you've done with it and the marks that you've made with it on the paper, which is a good thing. But it also, if I were to rub my hand on this, I would probably be able to take most of it off, right? There's not until you put some spray fixative on your drawing, there's not a lot of permanence to what you do with anything in soft pastels. It's also why if you go to the art museum and you look at Degas pastel drawings, you'll see some pastel on the glass of the frame, right? Because even something like Degas drawings will have a little bit of impermanence to them. And you can see that in museum quality drawings sometimes, right? They can be a little bit fragile. So this is kind of the idea here. I have, reds, I have blues, I have browns. These are all kind of interacting and overlapping, but I started with yellow, right? So there is a lot of kind of mutations that colors can take, right? And the subtle changes that can happen. And, don't be afraid to get darker and heavier. For example, if I say, you know what, that red reflection from that apple is really pretty strong, I'm going to go back and add some more to it, right? It's not like it's not like you can't go backwards or you can't soften it, because there's very much this kind of feeling of painting, right, with both pastels. But one thing that is a little bit of a word of caution is that sometimes the drawing paper that you guys are using, the one that I'm using, can at some point start to kind of resist more layers. If you have spray fixative is something that you can use a layer of spray fixative if you like what you have in your drawing so far and you don't want what you have to disappear, but you want to keep working on it, right? You can use something called spray fixative to kind of make what you've got a little more permanent as you keep working. So that's a possibility. So you can invest in something called spray fixative. It's also called workable fixative, right? So that if you want to invest in something like that when you get pastels, if you haven't bought those yet, certainly look for something like that at the store.
I use my grandma's big can of Aquanet.
Sure, Aquanet is a much loved secret material that artists like to use. And Aquanet, as long as it's aerosol, you can use aerosol hairspray and give it a light coat. The difference though is that Aquanet is not workable necessarily. You can spray it, but you can't necessarily work back into it, although you can work on top of it. And just a word of caution not to use too much of it, because that can, it can provide kind of almost like a slick barrier that's hard to, hard to work on top of. But good thing to bring up. Okay, let's go to maybe one more object here. So if I look at my apple, lots of color in that apple, right? I've got yellows, I've got a little bit of a greenish tint, there's some red obviously, but I've also got some shadow that's over here on the left. So let's figure out how to do that. What I'm going to do is to start with the lightest color, right? I'm going to start with a whole layer of my yellow. It's the lightest value. It's going to warm the temperature of that apple. And there may not be much of that yellow down at the bottom, but definitely here on the top half, I'm going to put a pretty thick layer of my yellow. Right? It doesn't have to be exact, because I'm going to be working on top of it, right? I'm going to be blending it out, and nothing is like done in a single layer with pastels anyway. You're going back and forth, back and forth. All right, so I've got my yellow here. Now I'm going to switch to the next kind of temperature that I'm noticing, right? So the much warmer, kind of intense heat of the red kind of pops up in places in that section. And I'm using strokes that imitate a little bit of the curvature of the apple, right? The three-dimensional form. But again, none of this is really permanent, right? So I'm just kind of laying in the color, knowing that I'm gonna blend it out a little bit. And it also helps that I've got some yellow underneath it, right? Because it's definitely not just red in those places. Oh, having some yellow to mix is a good thing. And down here at the bottom where it gets really dark, I'm still going to put that red because I'm going to mix some other colors with it, right? I'm going to avoid the end of my pear, which overlaps it just slightly. And I'm not going to blend that right away. I'm going to keep it as it is. I notice a little bit of green that comes out from the middle. I'm going to put that in there. And then what I'm going to do here is to work back in with my yellow. I'm going to pull some of that red together with the yellow that's underneath it. And again, kind of moving around the contour of the apple shape. Hoping to imitate those kind of striations that happen. But because I'm using the red and the yellow back and forth, there is such a thing as kind of overdoing it and over blending it. So if I feel like what I'm doing is kind of making everything too much the same, I don't want to do that. So if I've got some red on the end of my yellow, I'm going to wipe that off. And I'm going to say, okay, where do I need it to be really yellow? I'm going to go back with just yellow. Kind of re-emphasize the solid yellowness in some of those places. Wipe the red off. So I've got some patches that are really just kind of yellow, right? And then I want those sections that are red to look like they're showing up as red, but to also integrate them. I'm doing that with some of these lines. All right, so one thing I also want to think about before I get into the really dark values is everyone sees in the photo, you see this really bright white highlight, right? So I've got all the colors in place, and if I know I'm done with the color description, the color blending, that's when I can start to kind of lay in some of those highlights. So any more kind of, fudging around with my color that I want to do. So for example, if I have some stronger reds that I feel like I need to go back in with, do that before you put those highlights in. Maybe the red gets a little more red up here. There's a little spot of red. All right, so let's say that I feel like I'm done with the yellows and the reds. I'm ready to put in that highlight. So I want to make sure that I don't have a really dirty stick of white, right? I have a little bit of yellow on the end of it, so I'm just going to wipe that off. But I've got a clean edge to my white pastel. And what I want to do is to really dig in with that white and lay in the bright white highlight that kind of moves around the apple. And if I'm picking up the color under it, I want to keep going back and wiping off to make a clean start to the shape of that bright white highlight. This is also an instance where it can be much more helpful to have a little bit of fixative, because then you're able to kind of keep what's underneath in place as you're adding something like a bright white highlight. You're not picking up as much. But as you can see, even without fixative, Pastel allows you to put things on top of other things, right? The layering process is definitely possible. So there's another little bit of a highlight that happens right here on the red. All right, so I could kind of keep going with the effects of highlight. It could be also really interesting to do this kind of highlight effect with the white on top of my color with the lime, for example, because the lime has some highlights there that are really, really bright white. But I think to give us a little bit of contrast, we need to go ahead and put the brown that happens around the stem. Let's put that in there. And we've got a little shape of the stem that also actually has a highlight in and of itself. So put that in there as well. And maybe a slightly whiter bit of brown along the length of it. And one thing that happens sometimes is the color of something like a stem, which is very neutral, it has a highlight nonetheless, right? So even though it's kind of brown in color, I'm gonna go ahead and put a little bit of white in there. And if I need it to be darker still, I'm gonna take just a little bit of my black and I'm gonna put just a tiny amount of the corner of my black. I'm also gonna, when I use black, sometimes the black by itself just looks really too harsh and too abrupt. So I'm going back there with my original brown and just kind of subduing it a little bit. And one thing I'm going to do while I'm still working on this demo is one last thing with the apple. I've got my reds, my yellows, I've got my highlights, a little bit of green, I've got some brown and some black. But if I look at the apple here, what I notice is that I'm going to kind of widen the shape of it slightly. What I notice is that it gets very dark and very cool and very shadowed, right? If I look at this section of it, what should I add to my colors that would make it look like that really super, super dark shadow that's happening there? Any ideas from you guys?
Would you add green?
I could add,
color?
yeah, I could add a green, which would be the complement of red, right? So that's definitely an idea because it's very much more, it's much more neutral. It's not really intensely red. So I don't want to use something like this green, which is very light, right? So there's a lot of white in that. So I don't want to use that one to make it darker. But if I had something like a really dark green, this could be an interesting thing to mix with the red, right? So let's go ahead and use the complement of red. I'm going to put a layer of that green. A little bit of it over here. And I'm going to go back with my red and work that green into the paper a little bit, mixing it, right, with the red that's already on it.
Question.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know if you're going to be able to address this or not, but the shadow beside the banana where it goes into that crevice, since that's predominantly yellow, would you stick with your blue scheme like you used before?
Yeah, that's a good question. We'll jump back to the banana because there's one kind of last step with that I would take there. But yeah, remind me when we get back to it.
And then you're using green and then brown on top of the green, or just green for the shadow in the red?
That was just my dark green that I put on top of the red, and now I'm using the red again to kind of mix the green with the red that I had, right? So again, you're going back to your original color to kind of be the blender, to kind of be the paintbrush. And so in this instance, my dark green was a pretty good choice for creating a shadowed version, right, of that red. There might be places that seem like they're much more cool. Like, so if I added a little bit of my deeper blue, for example, I'm gonna put a little bit on the left, maybe a little bit right in this section. So it can feel like, oh my gosh, I put too much blue. It looks weird. Or if you add some green to something that's red, if you're, if you're kind of too intimidated by the intensity of the color, don't be, because pastels are very forgiving, right? You can simply go back with the original color to subdue them, right? To mix them. So one thing I want to avoid doing is over blending, right? That can be a pitfall. So for example, if I've got to a point in my description of my apple here where I feel like I have some nice differences of color, there is a cool temperature, there is a warm temperature, there is definition of things in my object, it could be prudent at that point not to do anything else, right? And sometimes the more you mess with something, the more you blend it, the more everything starts to look the same, right? And that can happen, right? I've been there. So once you create some definition and some differences, it can be a good idea to just move on. And then if you still feel like you need to blend it some more, you can always come back and, and do some more blending. But it can be good to put those differences in there and then to not allow yourself to mess with it too much, right? And so do kind of a minimal amount of blending where you're working the color, you're adding another color, but you're going back to the original one to kind of to work that color back into the paper a little bit. But then you can always come back to it later. So let's jump back to the banana. The crevice of the banana meeting the apple, obviously in the photograph, has a really dark shadow, right? So as Matt, you were noticing, it gets almost close to a black. We definitely want to put that in there, but one thing I'm not going to jump right to is black, because I want to kind of, work my way up a little bit. There's right along this section, actually a second banana that comes in underneath this first one. So I'm not gonna bother to kind of do too much to that one for the purpose of time here. But what I am gonna do is to kind of stick with my dark brown.
And dark brown's what you use to darken the side of the banana as well, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
And the reason I used brown instead of black is that, again, black can look too harsh. And black added to anything yellow turns it green almost immediately. And so don't add black to make something yellow dark. Reach for the brown first. And even where I put the reds in there, that's working your way up with those warm temperatures, and something that's yellow first is a good choice. So I put in my dark brown. I'm gonna let just a little bit of that dark brown blend with the edge of my banana. But it's probably the case, for example, that the shadow, as it gets right between them, does get black. So I'm gonna go ahead and put a little bit of black in there. I'll go ahead and continue the kind of that separation shadow, right, between the banana and the apple. But I also kind of want to be, again, careful with the black. Even if I blow black across something, it's gonna, sometimes will leave black, black with it. So I'm gonna be kind of cautious about that. And then if you have something like a dirty eraser, instead of using your finger to blend something together, use the end of that dirty eraser to kind of push the medium together and to blend it. Matthew mentioned the Q-tip. You can definitely use a Q-tip to do this as well in those tight corners. But the places of that banana that again start to get lighter happen towards the middle of the banana where it reflects the light of the apple back onto it. So I kind of want to leave that lighter. But what I'm doing here is just kind of transitioning the black into the brown shadow of the banana that I have next to it. And then something I also noticed is that, I don't know, maybe in the process of drawing here, I kind of covered up the red that was reflecting on the banana. So I'm going to put a little bit of that back in. Going back with my yellow to kind of work that color back into the banana. So this is the idea, you know, again, avoiding black except for the very, very darkest and coolest of shadows, right? So even in this black shadow between two objects like a banana and an apple, there's quite a lot of brown in it, right? So, and there might be places where I still maybe need to soften the shapes a little bit. Perhaps, you know, there's a little more refinement to do between those objects that would have a little bit less to do with darkening and more to do with brightening something. If I need to brighten something in a pastel drawing, it is pretty hard to get back to the white of the paper. So I wouldn't try that. But what you want to do is clean your eraser, right, on a dry, clean piece of paper towel or another piece of paper or a piece of sandpaper. And then you can certainly kind of lift a little bit of the medium. So for example, if I feel like this section of the banana right next to the apple, I need to brighten a little more and it just won't brighten by adding yellow, I can do that a little bit to some extent, right, with my eraser. So that can help, but if I clean it up enough and I go back with my yellow, I can create a little section where it's not as heavy and the yellow is able to do something more, okay, to transition a little better. Back to the light. So maybe this helps a little bit in terms of what we hope to do in terms of our practice with color. The other objects in the still life, like the lime, have more of a cool temperature, right? So those greens are going to pop nicely against all of the reds and the yellows and the oranges that I have in the drawing already. And the blue tablecloth that's up here in this section is also going to be a nice shift in terms of color. That's going to look, you know, pretty good against, for example, the red of the apple and the yellow of the banana. So if I add something like this is just my blue. It's not exactly the blue of that tablecloth, but it's kind of the closest thing that I've got here.
And if you were going to shade that line, would you use blue?
Shade what line?
The line beside the apple, like say I'm going in for the...
Oh, the lime. I thought you said the lime. So for the lime, I would use the closest color that I've got in my set, right? I don't have many colors. These are the two greens that I have. So I would definitely want to start with something like this, right? So if I look at what color that really is, it may be somewhat close, but it's not exactly the color of the lime that I'm looking at in my picture, right? So I want to think about...
Could you start with yellow for that?
You could. I think what, you know, shortcut here is that if I know it's going to be a fairly light green and I've got a fairly light green, I can put that on there, but then I can take my yellow, because I would definitely take some yellow and warm it up, right? So Ivan, you're completely right. I would definitely want to add a layer of yellow to the green color that I had, right? So this is much closer in terms of the lightest of the yellow greens that I'm looking at in the line. But then as it starts to get more shadowed, right, and cooler in temperature and darker in temperature, I'd be using more of that dark blue.
Okay, good. And then last question. I'm sorry because this is why I wish we were in class because I could stay after class and ask you questions. But
yeah,
for the skin of the pear, it's not. It's a little bit lighter than the brown you have in the box, and it's a little darker than the tan that you have there.
Mm-hmm.
So what would be just a good color combination to try and represent that? Would you use like a little bit of a orange and dark brown?
Yes. So let's see. If we put a layer of this brown, I'm not going to make it super, super heavy because this is the only brown that I've got. And it's much...
The tan for the meat, right?
What's that?
The tan color would be for the meat of the pear?
Oh, for the inside?
Well,
yeah.
I'm asking for both, actually.
Okay. So I started with my dark brown here. I put a light layer of that. But as you say, there's a little more of kind of a orangey, kind of reddish thing going on. So I'm going to take some of my orange, put that as a second layer on top of my dark brown.
Oh, that's nice.
And then I do have this weird kind of beigey, I don't know, peach or something. This, I think, instead of white, would get me, a little bit closer. So if I kind of work that into the paper a little bit and kind of do some blending with my fingers, I might look at what I've got, right? So something like this, right, which is a combination of dark brown, kind of this peachy color, and some orange, right? And I feel like there may be places that get a little more reddish. So if I put that kind of more reddish tone.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
All right, so I'm kind of warming up what I have in terms of browns with reds and oranges. Because I don't want it to be, like too chalky looking. But there are definitely places where I could start to get a little bit deeper, a little bit darker. And then places where it starts to get really light, again, I'm going to go back with my white and start to look at using the white to kind of add in the highlights and to round out the shape a little bit.
And that's probably what you use to get the meat color as well, is that peach with white and then highlight with brown.
Yeah, because there's just going to be more white involved on the inside of it, right? Because it's just a lighter value, but it's got a little hint of brown in it, right?
Or maybe even like just a tiny scotch of a red. It seems like it's a little warm from what I'm seeing on the screen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are some hints, some kind of pinkish tones to it, right? But just in this one brown, I've used all these different colors, right? So a lot of times it just takes like experimentation. And then, so the last thing I wanted to do with this background is that obviously I've got that blue in there, is nowhere close to what I'm really looking at, but I want to, while it's still in progress, I'm gonna use a little bit of my green. So that I've got a little bit of something between the blue and the green. And then I also want to add some darker value, right? There are places in it that do get a little bit lighter, but most of the fabric itself is not really a bright, it's not a bright teal. So to gray it out just a little bit, I am going to use my black. If I used brown, that would neutralize it, but it's a really dark value. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to my black.
So basically, you're going to use the brown to darken the warmer colors, and then use like a dark blue or a black to darken the cooler colors.
That could be a pretty good rule of thumb. I think there may be some exceptions, but yeah, I think using brown and working your way towards black and using the black absolutely where you need it, right, is probably a good kind of rule of thumb. So something kind of like this is going to be that, I've used these 3 different colors, blue, green, and black, to make up just that one base color, right? So now what I want to be thinking about is, okay, to that color, I'm going to be wanting to add some whites that describe, for example, there's kind of a bright white wrinkle, and not a bright white wrinkle, a lighter blue wrinkle.
This pastel work seems like a good precursor to actually working with oil paints. Is the color combinations and mixing similar?
Yeah, I mean, the same color theory ideas are going to apply whether you're using paint or whether you're using, dry pastel. So yeah, it can be good practice, right? Color practice. So if I'm adding a little bit of white to that color, that's going to be kind of, what creates my kind of lighter sections. But then obviously using some black to create those wrinkles. If I move it up against the edge of my bowl, underneath my banana, where it gets really dark. But here I'm using black, but I don't want the black to look like it's black on top of my blue. I want it to look like a dark version of blue, right? So a blue-green. So I'm going to go back again with my blue and work that black back into the paper. All right. So maybe that helps. I think, as you're working, there's a lot of soft pastel medium that falls off, right? You see lots of that. Try to resist blowing it, because if I blow that stuff across, for example, my light yellow banana or my white highlights, they're going to gray out, okay? So what I usually try to do is to, when I get lots of medium on there and it's time to kind of clear that off, is just to go ahead and turn your drawing over and shake it, right? So that it's not everything is raking on top of your highlights. And then hopefully it hasn't kind of grayed out everything that you've drawn, okay? If you're working kind of from top to bottom, obviously you can shake it this way so that everything kind of falls off the top edge, right? But try to avoid raking that stuff on top of, all the light stuff. So that's kind of the basic technique with color. Have fun. It's very messy. And hopefully you have a little bit of space where you can get a little messy with it. Does anyone have any